Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of our discourse analysis tutorials. Today we're going to be taking our second look at propositions, as well as our first look at prepositions, as in prepositional phrases. And these are really going to build on the rules of thumb that we had from before. So these will be the exceptions to the rule, although crucial exceptions that are really going to help you navigate the foundation of DA. So the rules of thumb we had last time were, when you want to find your propositions, start by feeling it out and looking for one complete thought in every line. Secondly, make sure you can locate only one verb per line. And then finally, to pass over your work a third time and make sure you have one conjunction or connector that starts every line. And those are going to be your key words, things like and, when, therefore, and so on. Now, before we go on, all of this is actually very, very important because propositions are really going to make up the foundation of every discourse analysis. So any weakness in that foundation now is definitely going to surface later on when you're trying to locate your main point. So let's start off with the definition we had from last time, and that is propositions are formed with every type of verb. But of course, there's got to be some exceptions to that. So today we're going to start off with our first two exceptions, and these are going to be instances where a verb is actually present, but you will not be able to divide it into a new proposition. And then after that, we'll look at two instances where the verb is not present, but you actually will have to divide it into a new proposition. So let's see how this works. Taking our starting point as rule number 2 from last time, we said if you see that verb, just slice a new proposition. But our first exception is going to come from what we call complex noun phrases. Noun phrases are part of the phrases that make up sentences, and those could be things like noun phrase, verb phrase, adverbial phrase, prepositional phrase, and so forth. So we've got some easy examples here to start off with. Things like the boys ate the bread when they walked to the fields. So far, so good. But if you were thinking that the subject of this sentence is simply the word boy, there's actually more to it than that. The entire subject is the complete noun phrase, the boys. And we can make a noun phrase as complex as we want it to be. I could say the boys who grew up in Jerusalem, or the boys who mocked the bald prophet who was teaching discourse analysis. No matter how many verbs or descriptors you want to glue inside of that noun phrase, it's still going to function as one giant noun as the subject or the object of the sentence. So that brings us to our first exception. When you see a noun phrase, don't split a noun phrase in half if it contains a verb. Let's see how this works in the scriptures. In John chapter 9, the Jews are investigating the man who had been born blind but had received his sight. And it says they did not believe this until they called who? The parents of the man who had received his sight. Who is the object of the verb call? It's the parents, right? But as I continue on, I'll see this verb received, and I would be ready to slice this to a new proposition right away. However, if I understand I'm dealing with a complex noun phrase, I see that they called the parents of the man. Can we say more? Definitely. They called the parents of the man who had received his sight. So all of this is bound together as one giant object of the verb called within this proposition. So I won't be able to split this in half, even though there seems to be a verbal idea inside of it. You can see this in parallel with the next proposition. It says they called this giant object, and then they questioned them, which refers to the entire object above, even though there's a verb glued inside of it. So make sure you don't divide those noun phrases when they contain verbs. Let's take a look now at our second exception. The second exception comes from the same rule of thumb, but this time we'll say not to divide what we call complementary or helping verbs. So let's see how this works in Judges chapter 19. It says, on the fourth day, they got up early in the morning, and he prepared to go. Now you can kind of feel that these two verbs are working together. He prepared, and then to go. If I were to get rid of this verb here, prepared, all I have is the statement, and he to go. Pretty useless. But if I were to divide this as I would a normal proposition and say, and he prepared, then I see the verbal idea to go, and I slice it to a new line. All I have now is the proposition, and he prepared. That's a completely different sense than the scriptures had before. What did he prepare? What was he preparing? Well, he prepared to go. And so I have to put that complementary verb back because it's actually functioning as what we call a helping verb. So to take a step back and review what we've looked at so far, We said when the verbal idea is used as the subject or the object, don't divide it, or when you see complementary verbs, don't divide them either. Or in other words, if you see a verb glued in with other nouns, you won't be able to separate it. Or when you see verbs that are glued together, you won't be able to separate them. And if you'd like to pause the video here and take a look at these additional examples, feel free to do that now. Here are also some examples. We won't spend any extra time on these, but if you'd like to pause the video to brush up on what kinds of helping verbs you'll see, these will help you identify the major verbs to be, to have, or to do. Or additionally, you can pause to look at the 10 major helping verbs called modal verbs. These are pretty easy to identify, but if you need to brush up on your English grammar, which many of us do, feel free to pause and see the examples of the can, could, might, should, would type of helping verbs, and that'll help you identify when you're dealing with a complementary construction. Okay, good. Let's move on now to our final two exceptions, and these are going to deal with times not when the verb is present, but when there does not seem to be a verb present, but I still have to divide it into a new proposition. This first example is going to come from what we call implied verbs. And we're going to say implied verbs must be divided because we need to treat implied verbs just like any other verb. Or in other words, slice a new proposition. But remember also that implied verbs can be formed by what we call negation. In other words, not just what's being said, but what's not being said. Let's take a look at the Apostle Paul's example in 1 Corinthians 10. Speaking of the Gentiles who do not know God, he says, the things they sacrifice to demons, line 1, and not to God, line 2. In line 1, I clearly see the verbal idea to sacrifice. But in line 2, there's no verb that jumps right out to me unless I understand that when he says, and not to God, he's really using the implied verb sacrifice from line 1 and saying, they sacrifice to demons, and they do not sacrifice to God. So if I understand there's an implied verb in there, I need to be able to divide that just like any other verb. Easy enough. Let's take a look now at our last exception, and this is going to come back from the idea of phrases once again, but this time we'll be talking about prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases, first of all, can have implied verbs just like we just talked about. For example, if someone asks the question, where did you put my Greek New Testament? You could simply answer with a prepositional phrase, on the shelf. But this prepositional phrase, we understand, is not a complete correct sentence in English grammar. It's actually a sentence fragment, unless I understand that the answer to the question, where did you put my Greek New Testament, carries over that verbal action of putting the book away, and it has the implied verb put within the answer itself. The implied verb is, I put your Greek New Testament, and then the prepositional phrase, on the shelf. So you can treat these like they have implied verbs. But even at moments where you can't clearly tell that there's an implied verb operating, you still will need to slice a prepositional phrase to a new proposition every time.